Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Karen Yarhimilo. I'm the Dean of the School of International Public Affairs and the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations. And thank you so much for being here today with us. We live in an era defined by economic, social, and political uncertainty, from geopolitical conflict to the effect of climate change, to the backsliding of democracies around the world, and the need to align on shared priorities has never been more urgent. Solving complex global problems requires having conversations, real conversations, with people who may not agree with you, to build a more resilient future. Indeed, to build a more resilient and less polarized society, we need real, open, constructive dialogue. It is critical, and this is the core of our mission here at SIPA. Fostering civil discourse is one of the reasons we launched the Institute of Global Politics earlier this semester in October, to bridge the gap between the theory and the practice to advance innovative, actionable solutions to some of our toughest challenges. And for that, we must be willing to reach across the aisle. And that is why I am so thrilled to kick off the latest installment of IGP's Across the Aisle series. But before I introduce today's speakers, I want to thank the Knight Foundation, our co-sponsor for this event, an institute dedicated to supporting free expression and the First Amendment, both of which are cornerstone of our democracy. For SIPA students in the audience seeking a career in public service, and I know that there are many of you here and many more watching in the live stream, I really cannot think of better speakers than the two we have with us today. They may have traveled different paths, and they certainly are from opposing political parties, but they are alike in many ways, including their mutual respect for the institutions of governance, and share a deep commitment to engaging in open dialogue. Ron Klain served as White House Chief of Staff under President Joe Biden. Ron has held a long career in government service in roles including the Chief Counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Staff Director of the Senate Democratic Leadership Committees, and Chief of Staff to Vice President Al Gore and Vice President Biden. Mick Mulvaney was White House as Chief of Staff to President Trump. Prior to his role as Chief of Staff, Mick was Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and member of the U.S. House of Representatives from South Carolina's 5th District. Ron and Mick will be joined on stage for a discussion moderated by Amna Nawaz, co-anchor of PBS NewsHour, and prior to joining PBS in April 2018, Amna was an anchor and correspondent at ABC News, leading the network's live coverage of the 2016 presidential election. Please join me in welcoming Mick Mulvaney, Ron Klain, and Amna Nawaz to the stage.
Hello, gentlemen. Good afternoon, everyone. How are you today? Good, great. Thank you so much for being here in person. Thank you also to our live stream audience following along wherever you are. Most of all, thank you, Ron. Thank you, Mick, for being here.
Well, thank you for having us.
I have to say, it is rare to be able to get two such senior leaders on the same stage or in the same room at the same time, even in the work that I do at the NewsHour. And
we have a lot more
really
free time now than we used to. So.
Well, let's jump right in, guys. We're going to talk a little bit about their time serving in administrations, about what's going on in the world today. And then I also want to thank you for submitting some of your questions in advance, too. We have those, and we will get to those at the end as well. Let's just start off with what a chief of staff does. I think there's a lot of mystery, maybe a lot of confusion around the role as well. So depending on your president, depending on the time you're serving, you can do the job differently. Ron, if you had to very succinctly say, what is your primary duty and responsibility in that role, what would you say?
I'd say it's to organize and direct the White House staff in service of the president's agenda, hiring the staff, removing staff members when they need to go, overseeing their work, and making sure that we're doing what we need to do to help the president achieve his objectives.
What about your relationship with the president? How do you look at that?
I think if you're doing the job right, you're the president's chief advisor and the person who tells him bad news many days, and the person who he relies upon for honest coordination advice. I had a very open door policy at the White House. We had a lot of people who had direct access to the president. I made sure he heard from a lot of different opinions, diverse opinions, and I think that you have to be confident enough in the job to not feel threatened by the fact that you might hear other points of view.
Mick, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. There's a very vivid memory I have of going in late one night. President only slept about 4 hours a night, and I can't do that, so I'd work from about 6 a.m. till about 8. Every night, at the end of the day, I'd go in with a list of things that happened that day or things that are going to happen the next day. And one at him, then I was like, okay, boss, here's the deal. Nancy's not coming tomorrow because she's upset about one of your tweets. The two senators who are supposed to come, Senate wrapped early, so they're going home to do a fundraiser. They're skipping out. The secretary of so-and-so and secretary so-and-so are fighting with each other over a policy, so they won't sit next to each other at the dais on the event tomorrow. There's a threat against one of your family members. It's okay, but there might be a little higher level of security. We need to let them know. And the fence around the building is 6 months overdue and $50 million over budget. And he looked at me and said, Mick, tell me exactly what it is you do. And I said, Mr. President, I tell you all the stuff you don't want to hear, and I do all the stuff you don't want to do. And it's the same thing that Ron just mentioned. It's that you have to have that person in the operation, or else you don't have a good operation.
You stepped in to replace John Kelly. You stepped in to replace Reince Priebus. Did anything surprise you about the job?
No, keep in mind, I was the only one that went to work for him that actually knew him. Reince had run the Republican National Committee and had some interactions with him as a candidate, but didn't work with him. John Kelly was in the cabinet, was over at DHS, and you don't have cabinet secretaries, contrary to what many people think, don't have a daily interaction with the president. I was the OMB director. And I think there's a reason, what is it, like 6 or 8 or 10 of us have gone from being OMB director to being chief of staff, because you're with the president a lot more. And after me, Mark Meadows didn't know the president hardly at all. So I think I knew him better than the other 3 people.
Ron, as the dean mentioned, you'd previously been a chief of staff to Mr. Biden as vice president.
Yeah.
How different was it between that role, serving a vice president, and chief of staff to president?
Well, different is night and day. I mean, the vice president has an important role in the White House, but the vice president isn't the president. He or she's not the decider, and not the head of state, not the head of the government, and so it's a very different role the president has than the vice president, and a very different role that their chiefs of staff have.
Yeah.
What you said you had to be able to speak freely, be able to deliver bad news.
Yeah.
Do you remember any one time in particular that you were like, I really don't want to have to say this, but it has to be said?
Well, I never thought of it that way, because that is my job was to tell them things that were good news or bad news. So it wasn't like I don't want to have to tell you this, because that's the job.
It's just news, yeah.
If you don't want to have to tell them that, you shouldn't be doing the job. But certainly there were plenty of times we had bad news, it was my job to convey that when it happened.
Were there times you disagreed? And because you had a very long personal relationship,
Yes.
right? You know each other very well, 4 years. Were there times that you disagreed and you had to convince him to see things your way?
It's not a question of having to convince him. There definitely, I always went in there with a point of view, and in the end he decided, and sometimes I was persuasive and sometimes I wasn't.
Which happened more?
Well, I'll say this, because I knew him so well. We often saw things the same way, and so that was the most common outcome.
Yeah.
I knew what he wanted. I was there to help achieve his agenda. I knew what his agenda was. I'd been a part of the campaign. We had run on 4 big principles. We got in. We had to go do our 4 things.
How did your legislative experience, I mean, you mentioned knowing Mr. Trump for years, but how did that help in terms of advancing the president's agenda?
It just did. The House, both the House and the Senate are their own things, right? And you can't teach somebody. It's like learning a foreign language. You can learn it, but you can't really speak it until you go immerse yourself in that language. And the House and the Senate are the same, or at least they're similar. And so the nice thing about the legislative experience was that it was myself and Mike Pence had been in the House together. We had been there at the same time and knew each other. And because it was so recent, we knew most of the members of the House in both parties, and we knew leadership extraordinarily well. So that helped. The Senate was different. And anybody who's from the House will tell you that there's an institutional tension between those things. It has nothing to do with party affiliation. There's an institutional tension between the House and the Senate. It was much more difficult to sort of get a feel for and a read on the Senate. So the legislative history helped with the House. But I also brought biases into that role against the Senate, because if you're a good House person, you hate the Senate. And if you're a good senator, you hate the House, right? So I guess it probably cut both ways.
We had kind of the opposite dynamic in the Biden
I guess
White
that's
House.
right, yeah.
President Biden had served in the Senate for 4 decades. I had been a longtime Senate staffer. Most of the senior White House staffers had worked in the Senate. And I had a very, very close relationship with Senator Schumer, who was obviously the majority leader of the Senate, still is. And that made us all a little suspect to Speaker Pelosi, even though she was our best political ally and the best person to deliver for us and the person who got things done in amazing ways. She would always, whenever I talked to her, she'd always say, well, you Senate people over there think this. And so, I agree with Mick. The tension between the House and the Senate in some ways is even stronger than the partisan tensions, although those were quite strong too. And we were definitely a Senate operation at the White House.
So what did that mean for you? I mean, because if you look back, especially in his first couple of years, President Biden was actually able to get through a lot of bipartisan bills. How did you navigate that as chief of staff on the House side?
Well, on the House side, basically, if we tried to cut the bipartisan deals in the Senate, I had a very candid and direct relationship with Senator McConnell and Senator Young from Indiana and a couple other Republican senators we would deal with. And our view was if we could get our 60 votes in the Senate, then we just let it go in the House. In the end, if we needed to, Speaker Pelosi could line up the Democratic votes. We could pass on Democratic votes alone in the House. That was a great credit to her. We had a 4 or 5 seat majority in the House, so it's a lot harder than it seems. But we always knew we had that as a backstop. So in the House, if we could get Republicans to come along, that was just a good thing. And often, if you got, we had some bills where we got 20 Republican senators vote with us and only 5 or 6 Republican House members. Which you think about the relative size of the two, it's a gigantic disproportionate outcome. But the Senate was just a little more wired for the bipartisan work than the House was, and we had more success in the Senate than we did in the House.
You agree with that?
We do, because we had the exact opposite experience. Of course, different bills are different, right? But the one I remember is on the repealing of the Affordable Care Act, which we knew we were never going to get Democrat support for that. That's fine. It's one of their signature successes. But we got our bill passed through the House after a lot of hard work and could never get it through the Senate. John McCain ended up voting against us at the end of the day. So I think that we had a much stronger relationship with the House. Of course, Trump was more sort of philosophically aligned with what was happening in the House, a lot more populist. And the House is, a very energetic. It's supposed to be, right? The House is supposed to reflect the emotions of the people, and the Senate's supposed to be the warming saucer, whatever the founding fathers said. And Trump is not a warming saucer, so he was naturally more aligned with the House, and I think that you saw that in the outcomes.
Mick, you were also there in an acting role, right? Technically, it was acting chief of staff.
Yeah. So.
Which we know President Trump liked to use a lot, right?
Yeah.
There were a lot of people in acting roles. Did that in any way, did it hinder your ability to do the job, limit it in any way?
Yeah, no, because there's no such thing as an acting chief of staff.
Right.
And I told the president
so why
that.
Acting?
Acting is when you're filling in for somebody who's a Senate-confirmed position. You can take one Senate-confirmed position and put them in another Senate-confirmed position on an acting basis for a period of time. I was the acting director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau because I had been Senate-confirmed at OMB and was able to fill those 2 roles at the same time. When he hired me, he said, look, We were having some difficulty at the time in the White House. John Kelly's relationship with him had soured. The morale in the building was very, very low. He had seen what we had done at the CFPB and said, I want you to come in. He goes, it's like a turnaround. It's like take a company and turn it around. Come in and do it for 6 months, and then you go back and do your OMB thing. And I said, that's fine. And he said, we'll call it acting. And I said, that's because that way it had a specific endpoint. He hated firing people, by the way, still does. Does not like to fire people despite what you'd think from the television program. But if it had a set term, you could just come in and then you'd naturally leave. And we extended that term from 6 months to a year for a variety of reasons. And I was supposed to leave at the end of 2020, but it was the middle of the impeachment. And we both agreed that it was not a good thing for a chief of staff to leave in the middle of impeachment. So as soon as impeachment ended, which was the first week in February, that's when I knew it was time to go. But no, aside from the title, by the way, the job actually pays better if you're acting. OMB makes about 20 grand, the OMB director makes about 20 grand more than chief of staff does.
I have to ask, just because I didn't expect you to say that, why do you believe that he hates firing people when everything we've seen seems to speak to the contrary?
Tell me who he fired. I think he only fired one person. John Bolton's the only person I think I know that he fired. He sent out tweets and stuff on other people, but he was my first job actually was to let Jim Mattis know that he was leaving. That was at Christmas of 2019. So yeah, no, he does not like. Listen, it's really. Anybody here fired people? It's really, really hard to do. It's really hard to go to somebody and say, look, I know you're relying on me for a job. I know you're relying on me to provide for your family. I know you're relying on me to sort of give you whatever credibility you have, your reputation, but it's not working out, you have to go. That is a really, really hard thing to do at any level. But it's what chiefs of staff end up doing. Again, we do the stuff that nobody else wants to do.
So one of the reasons, I know you're both here, and the core mission behind these conversations is to talk about how to work and talk across the aisle. Mm-hmm. And I think it's fair to say you both worked in deeply polarized environments in your roles. Do you agree with that?
That probably doesn't make any news. No.
Yeah. Were there moments in your tenures that you unexpectedly found common ground where you didn't expect to, and were able to move something forward, a piece of legislation or a meeting of some kind, some place that you thought this is going to be really, really hard, but you were able to reach across the aisle and bring something together?
I remember it happening. I don't remember it happening unexpectedly. We knew there were things we had Democrat support on that we could do, and then we knew there were things that we could never get Democrats to help us with. And I don't remember moving one from one category into the other. That's really difficult to do.
Yeah, I think the idea that there'd be surprising bipartisan support is unlikely, because you're really, when you've got a project that you think you can get bipartisan support, you think it for a reason. Yeah. Like, there are some Republicans who are for this. For us, the three big ones were the infrastructure bill, the Chips and Science Act, and the PACT Act, the veterans legislation. And from day one, we thought we'd have bipartisan support, and we did. And the only real surprise was how we started bleeding. Ex-President Trump came out against the infrastructure bill, and we started bleeding off Republicans who had told us they would vote for it, and people were scared to take them on, and we lost some of those people. But none of it seemed like a surprise.
Yeah, right to try, we had Democrat support. We knew we were going to have that. On civil justice reform, we knew we had Democrat support for that. We got it. And it did start to bleed, the same type of thing, but you still got it over the line. But I don't ever remember, we'd go to the floor on the Affordable Care Act and get 5 Democrat votes. That never happened. Yeah. So,
in having to be the person who says the thing that needs to be said, delivering the bad news, I imagine there are probably times when you have to take the position of maybe shutting down a bad idea or a bad impulse or a thought that you disagree with. Can you remember a time that you had to do that?
I do. But I don't talk about those times. One of the things, but there's a serious answer to that. There's a serious answer to that. Chiefs of staff, you have to disagree with the president. There's no question about that. But you're not the president, okay? The half a dozen times or so where I had to sit down with the president and say, we have a problem with this. This is wrong. Those were in private. It was never in front of the staff. Mm-hmm. And I know it was the same with the vice president. He was the other person who sort of looked at that role in our administration to sort of speak to the president candidly. So I usually don't talk about the times when those conversations had, because it's a very personal relationship between the president and the chief of staff. It just is. And you manage the staff, do the same thing, you make sure he sees all the sides of things. But if you really think something's happening wrong, I usually did that in private. Did you ever?
Yeah. I agree with that. In terms of stopping bad things, I will say that we had a meeting early on in the Biden administration that I wound up crosswise with a bunch of Republican senators because I thought they were headed off in the wrong direction. We tried to bring in Republicans, try to get a deal on the first bill we passed, the American Rescue Plan. And the president had promised in the Georgia runoffs that he would deliver the $2,000 individual relief check that Donald Trump had endorsed, but the Georgia Republicans running for Senate had opposed.
Okay.
So we'd gone down to Georgia and we had said, President supporting Senator Warnock, and said, look, if you elect Raphael Warnock, we will deliver you this relief check, and that's a big difference, and that's why you should vote for him, and I will do that. And we won that special election or runoff election in Georgia in early January. And then we were trying to put together the relief package to fund the vaccine deployment and to help small businesses and do these things. And we put that relief check in there. And some Republican senators came into the Oval Office and one of them said to the president, well, you made this promise. You don't have to keep it. It's a bad idea. There's not much support for it on the Hill. And so you should let's just drop that. We can bring down the cost of this bill a lot. I nodded my head no. I was like, we're not going to do that. I mean, the president went out and made a specific promise. He's not going to break his promise a month into office. And Senator Collins saw me and was very unhappy with that. Then Senator Romney gave a long presentation on how we should structure state and local relief. And his position was there should be no state and local relief. But he knew we were putting the bill in, so he said, well, you should do it this way.
Are you saying that Romney gave you a lecture? I find that hard to believe.
It was actually quite a thoughtful presentation. And actually, there was a lot about it he was right about. But I thought the idea that their position, negotiating position, was there should be nothing for state and local relief, but you should do it this way. Seemed like an odd position to be in. And then Rob Portman, who I like very much and worked with on a number of other things, said, well, we're not even going to talk about your plan for a child tax credit because this is an emergency relief bill and there's no way you can get that money into people's hands in 2021. It's impossible to do. I was like, no, we will do it. We've worked with the IRS. We're ready to go. We will do this. And Senator Portman says, well, I ran OMB. I know it's impossible. I said, well, I respect your leadership at OMB, Senator, but it's not impossible. It's possible. Not only is it possible, it will happen. We got the bill passed. We got the checks going out in June. So we were able to easily get them done in 2021. So that was it was a contentious way to start in the job. It was just about a month into it. There was 3 Republicans who we did a lot of work with, Senator Collins, Senator Portman, Senator Romney, and it was a tough spot to contradict them.
Continuing in this theme of, reaching across the aisle, areas that we need bipartisan support, and also being in this role of advising the most powerful person in the free world, one area we desperately need that kind of common ground is this foreign aid package that's being held up right now. Aid to Ukraine and Israel is being tied up in the debate over border policies, causing not just debates between Republicans and Democrats, but also among the Democratic Party itself. If you were in that role today, if you were chief of staff to the president today, what would you be advising him to do? What would you be advising the negotiators to do?
Well, I think it's different for each of us, right? Because the issue right now, at least in the last 24 hours, I understand they made some progress on this last night, is the tie-in, and the topics are not tied from a substantive standpoint; they're tied from a political standpoint. The border security issue, which is much more natural for us to. So I don't think you'd have that difficulty with us. We'd be down at the Senate going, yeah, you tie these two things together. That's great. It's less natural for the Democrats to do that. So I don't know if that's the best example because I don't know if we'd have the same type of pressure. I guess if I wanted to look at it this way, where would the difficulty be? We would probably have more difficulty getting people to vote for the aid itself. Aid to Israel is easy for the Republicans. Aid to Ukraine is a lot harder for us. So what we'd probably be doing is okay, look, we're getting all this on border security, even though you don't like the Ukraine aid. Let's figure out a way to push that. And that's what we tell the president to do: is get these guys down here, bring it. Face-to-face conversations count. They absolutely do. Just because you get elected to office doesn't mean you're no longer a human being. Right? And human nature is real, and it's just sometimes, most times, things are better face to face. So if you had folks come down and talk through this, say, guys, look, ladies, we know you don't like the Ukraine thing, but look at the Republican at the border package. Please vote for this, and if you do, and you think it's a problem back home, we will come down and help you sell the good stuff that your folks back home are going to like. So I mean, that's not unusual. You guys would do it on the other side, right?
Well, let me just follow if I can. So if there's no agreement on border policy, you'd be okay with Republicans blocking the aid to Ukraine?
I just think that what I'd like to see as a former member of Congress, I mean, this is not my role as chief of staff, is standalone votes and then go from there. We've not had a standalone vote on border, at least across both chambers. You've not had a standalone vote on Ukraine aid, Israel aid, or Taiwan aid. One of the things that some conservative Republicans don't like is when you take small bills and make them into really, really big bills to get you to vote for one thing that you like and take three things that you don't. That's how the city works, and I get that. But I understand the pushback that a lot of Republicans are doing on Ukraine aid. I understand the issues about corruption. That's one of my biggest concerns going forward, is that we spend $60 billion and 25 of it ends up with Ukrainian oligarchs someplace in the Italian mountains. So yeah, I understand the dynamic, and I think that's important as a chief of staff to understand. You have to understand how the building works. You knew how the Senate worked, and you can understand, so you get a feel for the place.
So I'd say a couple things. One, President Biden himself put border security in the original national security package. So the idea that it's going to be in there is not something he's opposed to. It was his original proposal. So I think it's making sure that the measures are smart and sensible and get done what they need to get done. And on the face-to-face thing, I think it's complicated, Mick. I think, times are so polarized that we'd often have Republicans say to us, look, we'll vote with the president, just don't make us come down there and nod our heads, because then that's harder for us back home, because it looks like we caved to the president. And so sometimes, people keep saying, why don't you bring these people to the White House? Well, bringing the people to the White House helps with some people, hurts with other people. And President Biden's always had an open door and an open phone. He's talked to Republicans all the time and works with Republicans. But I think sometimes the stage management of it is more complicated. Yeah. And a lot of Republican senators say to me, please don't ask me to come down to the White House.
I thought the genius of really good presidents who could get legislation done was not that you could convince somebody from the other party to get them to do what you wanted them to do. You had to convince your own party. Reagan was critical at getting Republicans to do stuff that he wanted them to do. Clinton was good at getting Democrats to do. I never saw our role as trying to convince Democrats to do what we want to do, because it was never going to happen. But could we get some Republicans who might not go along with a bipartisan deal? I thought that's where we spent more of our time.
Is that the bigger challenge now for President Biden?
No,
with the progressive wing?
I think he's done very well with getting Democratic votes. We've gotten almost unanimous Democratic support on everything. To get bipartisan things, you have to get Republican votes. Yeah. And there are some Republicans who've been willing to do business with President Biden on some matters, and he's had very frank and candid conversations with them. I remember on the infrastructure bill, we started off with Senator Capito. She had a proposal, and we worked with her for a while, and she came down to the White House a couple of times with the president. We couldn't get close enough, and so we finally ended that and started a negotiation with a gang of 10 senators, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans. Yep. And that's what really produced the outcome. But our work with Senator Capito laid the groundwork for a lot of that. So I think these conversations can be helpful even with senators from the opposing party. President Biden has personal relationships with a lot of Republican senators, and I think you just have to do it in a way that respects. He would always say we have to respect their politics too. We can't put them in a harder spot. If they want to do the right thing, let's make it as easy as possible. And I agree. We didn't have Democrats who said, look, if it's bipartisan, I'm against it. We had Democrats who were for or against certain things, but if we could bring along Republicans, they were always welcome that. And there were just some things where we couldn't. Obviously, on our major climate change legislation, we knew from the start we were never going to get Republican votes. We had to do it with all Democratic votes. And there our challenge was kind of getting lined up getting Senator Manchin lined up. But in general, we spent a lot of time trying to work on getting Republicans to join us in some of these projects. And I said we had a couple successes of true bipartisan support.
And that's a good point, because you had those relationships. Those are personal relationships from President Biden when he was in the Senate. We didn't have that. Yeah. But that was something. One of Trump's greatest strengths was he didn't have any friends in Washington. One of his greatest weaknesses was he didn't have any friends in Washington. So that's an excellent point. You had those personal relationships that you could draw on that we didn't have.
What about another big issue we know the administration and the country is grappling with in the Israel-Hamas war? If you were in that role as chief of staff, and it is your job, as you say, to provide that unflinching, unvarnished view of what you think the president should do, what would you be saying right now?
It comes back to the process. It comes back to, and we can have a long discussion about what I think happened wrong in the Trump White House after I left. But your job is to make sure the president gets really good information and has both sides, all sides of an argument presented to him or her. So you've got make sure that everybody who knows what they're talking about is in the room and explaining to the president what the various issues are. It would be easier for us, just because our party is more naturally aligned to support Israel than the Democrats are, sort of from just by their nature. I happen to think, by the way, that what President Biden has done has been excellent on this. I compliment them. But I'm not trying to steer the president where I want him to go. I'm making sure that folks who understand the issue, smart people on the issue, are there to have their say so that he can decide. It's one of the things he really liked to do. I mean, it doesn't have to do with Gaza, it had to do with trade. President Trump managed by conflict. I've seen other people do this. You can do this successfully as a CEO. He didn't sort of do it by collaboration. He would come in with people who really don't like each other. And I bring you in, and you've got two entirely different things, different perspectives on tariffs, for example. And we had some real shouting matches in the Oval Office because the president sort of saw himself as a judge. Okay, go back to the television program. And he would sit there and watch this smart person yell at this smart person, watch that smart person yell at that smart person, and go, okay, we're going to do this. Okay? That breaks down, however, when you're a smart person and you're an idiot. And that's sort of what happened towards the end of the administration. It doesn't answer your question, but again, chief of staff, it's important the chief of staff is not, your role is not to, you're not co-president, right? You're there to make sure the president is successful. And the president's going to be successful when they have really, really smart people in the room advising them. So it's not an exact answer to your question, but it's an answer to every question. What would you do on Gaza? What would you do on Taiwan? What would you do on anything? Get smart people in the room so the president has the best available information available to him so he can make the best decision, given the fact his name is on the ballot and yours isn't.
Well, let me ask specifically then, with regards to this conflict, who is someone you'd want to make sure you get in front of the president right now?
As much as I don't like him, I'd have John Bolton in there because I think he's certainly up to date on the issues. I'd probably pick a couple of senators, including folks from the other party, probably some of the Senate Foreign Relations people to come down and talk to about it. At some point, I'd want to get some input from the various think tanks in town. You know, it's sort of, I know that sounds like all the usual suspects, but that's how the town works. Mm-hmm. So no one specific comes to mind other than Bolton, and Bolton would be there.
Yeah. Ron, what about you?
So we had fewer shouting matches, I suspect.
Yeah.
And hopefully fewer idiots. But I will say that you know, it's a little different with President Biden because, and particularly in areas of foreign policy and national security, he brings his own extensive experience as a longtime chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and vice president for 8 years, working with Secretary Clinton on the national security team. So he has a lot of his own perspectives on his own relationships with foreign leaders and a long history with Prime Minister Netanyahu, for example, and other leaders in the region. And so he kind of starts, you know, with a well-developed slate of views about these problems, and then has people around him who, you know, have diverse perspectives, but many of whom he's worked with for a long time. Tony and I started on Joe Biden's staff at about the same time in 1986.
Tony Blinken,
Secretary Blinken. Yeah. So Secretary Blinken's been with him for 36 years. And so, you know, he knows Tony very well. He knows how he thinks. Tony knows very well how the president thinks. And while Tony often has, you know, different views, different perspectives, he's able to deliver it in a way that the president can absorb and internalize because they have 35 years of experience of communicating together. Secretary Austin also, he's known from his time in the military. And so his national security team's a bunch of people he's known a long time. Avril Haines, who's the director of national intelligence, has worked with the president for a very long time, worked on the Senate staff. Bill Burns, the CIA director, someone the president has a very long-term relationship with. So I think, you know, we started as a different scenario, which is, I'm not saying there's no groupthink here. People have different perspectives, unique perspectives, but there's pre-existing relationships between people. And Jake Sullivan, who's the national security advisor, who's brilliant, does a fantastic job, has worked with all these people for a long time. And so there's an established way of working together that helps bring things to the president in a timely way and an organized way, and lets him obviously be the ultimate decision maker.
Do you think he's hearing from everyone he needs to hear from right now?
I do. I think that these are very hard problems, and there are no simple solutions, but I think what the president's done is done a very good job in a very difficult situation.
Let me ask where we are politically, just taking a look at what's ahead in the next year
We're
now.
having such a nice discussion. You want to talk?
Yeah, I know. Sorry, I'm going to ruin it. The first early contests are coming up early next year. You see former President Trump has now a double-digit lead in all the major polls. Do either of you see any scenario in which he is not the Republican nominee?
I think it's a 95% chance he's the Republican nominee. So does that mean it's 100%? No. I mean, I suppose he's not going to, listen, the only thing that would make him drop out of the race is if he thought that he wasn't physically up to the job. He's very aware of his brand. He would, if he thought, and I mean no offense to the current president, if he thought that people were going to make fun of him the way they make fun of Joe Biden, he would not run. But that's the only thing that would change the outcome, and I don't see that happening.
If his own physical health, you say,
Yes.
it was compromised. That's
Right.
the only way.
He does not want, if he has to get help up and down steps, he's not going out in public.
Well,
Ron?
Like I said, we're having a nice conversation.
yeah, look, I think I'm not an expert on the Republican primary process, but it seems to me pretty likely that Donald Trump's going to be the nominee of the Republican Party. He's leading in all their polls, and I go to these meetings, and there are Republican donors and mixed groups, and they're like, we want someone else. And I'm like, well, your party wants Donald Trump, and I think that's the one thing, which is he's leading in the polls because a lot of most Republican voters want him to be their nominee, and so barring a piano falling on his head or something like that, I expect Donald Trump to be the Republican nominee for president, and so we'll have a rematch of the last one, and I think it'll be a tough campaign. I think it'll be a close campaign, but I think it'll come out the same way it came out the last time. I think President Biden will get reelected, and I think that it will be a tough fight. It always is. It's a close country, but I do think that President Biden will beat Donald Trump for a second time in a row.
You think he's the best candidate to beat Trump right now in the Democratic Party?
I think unquestionably he's the best candidate to beat Donald Trump. I think I'm not a big fan of the Trump presidency, but I never underestimated Donald Trump as a candidate. He was a very effective candidate. He beat an impressive field of Republicans in 2016 to be the nominee. The best Republican Party had to throw at him, and he beat them all. And then he beat an excellent Democratic nominee in 2016. He shouldn't be underestimated as a political force. And I think the idea that just any Democrat, any generic Democrat could beat him is just naive. He's a tough fighter. He has a way of shifting the electoral conversation, and I think the Democratic Party is best served by picking the one person who's ever beat Donald Trump to do it again, as opposed to trying to see if some other person could pull this off.
We're in this unusual situation, and I think this is fair. If I'm wrong about this, the Republican that the Democrats want to run against the most is Donald Trump. And the Democrat the Republicans want to run against the most is Joe Biden. And I think what you've really got is that and he may disagree with me on this, the only Democrat who could really lose to Donald Trump is Joe Biden. I think if they nominate anybody else, Trump gets crushed. And the only Republican that could lose to Joe Biden is Donald Trump. So the
I
race,
do disagree with that. I think
Nikki Haley would really, really beat Joe Biden. And I think Gavin Newsom would really, really beat Donald Trump. Again, we probably have disagreements, but I get the sense both parties want the other person who's at the top of the ticket to stay at the top of the ticket.
Are there other Democrats who could beat Trump?
I think there might be other Democrats who could beat Trump, but I'm not prepared to risk the future of the country on the idea that someone who hasn't done this before can do it when we've got someone who has done it before. So, St. George slew the dragon. If the dragon came back, I wouldn't want to go hire someone else to try to do the dragon slaying. So I think that, having someone who's shown that they can go toe-to-toe with Trump and beat Trump is the best qualification for doing this right now.
Well, let me ask you, getting back to the chief of staff role, while we're all here. In a second Trump presidency, we saw so many people who served alongside him who left. Many of them turned on him, and especially after January 6th. You yourself quit the administration after that. Who do you think he would get to advise him in a second term?
It's a really good question. And there's two answers to the question. One is who could he get that could get confirmed by the Senate? So I think there's a different answer for people who have to go for Senate confirmation. So it's really, really tough question. Really tough question. Who's the Attorney General going to be? I can't imagine somebody that Donald Trump would pick that the Senate would say, yeah, okay, we're okay with that person. And I can foresee a situation where the Republican and Democrat leadership of the Senate go to a newly elected, President-elect Trump and say, here's a list of 5 people you can have, pick one. And that's a strange constitutional sort of dynamic. So to spend more time on something that is easier to sort of wrap your head around is who's going to be in the non-Senate confirmed position. Our Chief of Staff is not Senate confirmed. The President can pick anybody in the whole world. You don't have to go through Senate confirmation. I think there's some really good people who are available who will still work for him. Russ Vought was my deputy at OMB, ran OMB after I left the administration. And OMB directors make a natural sort of transition into Chief of Staff because of all the things you're involved with, how much time you spend with the President. Some of the lawyers are still quite capable. But it's going to be different. Look, and I mentioned earlier about the idiots and got a good laugh line, but I want to follow back on that for a second. At the beginning of the Trump first presidency, at the beginning, the inner circle included the former CEO of ExxonMobil and the former president of Goldman Sachs. Say what you want to about the politics of either party. Those are serious people. At the end of the administration, the inner circle includes the guy that sells pillows at night on Fox News. Okay? So what is Donald Trump 2.0 going to look more like? The first part of Donald Trump or the last part of Donald Trump? And I fear it's going to be more of the last piece, that a lot of the folks who would have worked for him previously wouldn't work for him. And he's going to have a difficult time getting people to fill some of these positions. There will be people who step up. I think Mike Pompeo would come back if he was asked. I think Steve Mnuchin would come back if he was asked. But it's a short list of people who have worked for him before, I think, that would go back and work for him again.
Would you go back if asked?
No, in our position, it's not fair to ask because there's only like 3 or 4 positions that are promotions, right? I'm not qualified for Attorney General. I'm not qualified to lead the Defense Department. I guess you've gone from Chief of Staff at OMB to there's been Jack Lew went to Treasury. I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that, and no one wants to hire me as Secretary of State because it's a miserable job, right? So no, I'm more than happy to be a pundit and be on television and tell people what I think.
Well, I guess it's my job to make sure that none of this ever happens. We don't have to worry about it at all.
But there's not many places to go after you've been Chief of Staff, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm less worried about where I'm going. I'm more worried about where the country's going. And that's why I think it's so important for President Biden to get reelected, because the alternative, you listen to even Mick describe what a second Trump term would look like. It's so scary, so much chaos, so much uncertainty, so many bad people in bad jobs that I think the best direction for the country is 4 more years of Joe Biden.
Let me turn it back to the folks in the room here and those who are watching at home, because I think it's fair to say a lot of young leaders, they look at politics right now, they look at government, and many of them think it's not worth it. It's too divisive, they're not getting big things done, seems really defined by gridlock, and for people who want to go out and make a difference, that's maybe not the chosen path. Are they wrong? I mean, what would you advise people who are considering this kind of path but not sure?
I think they are wrong. I think that government service can be frustrating. There's times when it's personally painful, but I think it's a great way to make a difference. I'm proud of what we've done so far in the Biden administration. Just this week, the nations of the world came together in the Conference of Parties and agreed to have a phase out ultimately of fossil fuels as part of a way of addressing climate change. That's only possible because of Secretary Kerry's leadership, and he has a lot of great young people who work for him in his office at the State Department. There are great ways to serve, there are great ways to lead, and I think that government can make a big difference for the better. I'm proud of the bills we passed in the Biden administration, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is revolutionizing our use of electric vehicles in the country, solar power, wind power, putting us on a job-creating clean energy transition. The Chips and Science Act, which is going to result in America substantially lessening its dependence on Chinese-made semiconductors, so we can be a country where we own our own economic future, creating a lot of good, high-paying jobs in America, making semiconductors, controlling our own supply chains. So I think all these things have great opportunities for young people to get involved and to make a difference. And so I encourage people to think about government service as part of their careers. And I think it's hard, and change comes more slowly than you would like. And often some of the changes you want to see made don't happen. But I think the people who devote their lives to this work are devoting their lives to a very good cause and can make a big difference in the world, in our country and in the world.
Washington is a miserable place to be right now. There's no question, if you're in elected office. But Ron's right. There's other ways to serve other than in, running for Congress or the Senate or president or whatever. I'll throw add a different facet to it, which is state government still works, for the most part, in my personal opinion, in large part because they have to balance budgets, and balanced budgets force compromise, and they force tough decision making, and they force people coming together. So say what you want to about the federal government, state governments still function, and if you're really interested in doing something, go give your state government a try, or local government. Look, there's. By the way, I have such sympathy for those folks. I cannot tell you, I would rather be in Congress than be on the school board. And I'm just continued to be humbled by the people who are willing to serve in those lower level positions, because they can be really, really awful sometimes. People feel like they own you more if they know you better. I never had people protest at my house. I know there's people protesting my local county council folks all the time. So yeah, it's a tough business. It can be a tough business, but it can be very rewarding. But I encourage you to think about the government as more than just elected members of office. There's other places you can serve.
We're talking about reaching across the aisle. You are both here engaging with each other in a very honest, candid way. Thank you for that. What advice do you have for the young leaders of the future in terms of when we look at how polarized we are, how divided we are, what's something concrete everyone can do in their day-to-day lives that helps to close some of those gaps?
I'll try and give a short version of the story. The scariest thing I've heard in the last 5 years, I spoke to a group from UCLA, and I was there with John Carl. John was the ABC White House correspondent for when I was there. And we talked about my press conference. I was there with a group of students, and we went over my press conference during impeachment. And I told people what I said, and John told people what he thought I meant, and we were arguing pretty good. And at the end, John left, and I was hanging around, and a woman walks up to me, 20-something years old, high-achieving student at UCLA, and she says, Ms. Mulvaney, can I ask you a question? I said, yeah. She goes, are you friendly with that man? Are you friends with him? And I'm like, yeah, John Carl, I'm friends with him. And then she goes, really? And I could tell that this was not just a throwaway line. I'm like, yeah, I go to dinner with John, we go to baseball games together, our kids go to school. Yes, I consider myself to be friends with John Carl. Why are you asking? She goes, well, because it seems to me that you disagree with him on a lot of things. I said, yeah, especially what we just talked about. Why? She goes, well, I mean, I could never be friends with somebody that disagree with a lot. And I looked at her, and I knew she was sort of came at things from a center-left perspective by the way that we'd been there for about 2 hours. And I knew she'd interacted with some folks who were center-right. And I said, what about that young man you were sitting next to? She said, oh, he's very nice, but I'd never be seen with him in public. That frightens me to death. If you just can't talk to somebody who disagrees with you on difficult things, then we have a real problem. And you're starting to see that now. How are you going to fix Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid? How are you going to deal with $33 trillion in debt? How are you going to deal with Gaza, whatever comes after Gaza, if you can't even talk to people? I mean, there are folks in Congress right now who can't do what Ron and I are doing. And by the way, and they tend, not entirely, but they tend to trend younger. And that frightens me. You have to figure out a way to talk to folks that you don't agree with all the time. And even more, to push you harder, you have to figure out a way to be friends with that person. If you can. I never asked my wife what our politics were before we got married. That didn't ever come up in conversation. So you have to figure out a way to work with, in a way that you like, with people you don't always agree with.
Do you and your wife disagree on politics?
We used to. She's gotten more conservative now as she's gotten older. You have 24-year-old triplets, that does that to you. So.
Ron, what about you?
Well, look, I think if you're going to be engaged in public service, public life, humility is a good quality to have. And you should know what you believe in, and you should believe in what you believe in, but you should always listen to other points of view and not have so much confidence in what you believe in that you're not willing to have a discussion with someone who thinks differently, because you could be wrong. So I think that's the premise I come at with, which is I'm happy to have friends and colleagues who have different points of views, who are Republicans, because maybe I'm right, maybe I'm not. There's some things I feel more confident than other things, but But you know, tax policy, like, I don't know, it's complicated. And so that capacity to listen, test the soundness of your views, makes you smarter, makes you better. And so I think that's an important thing. My wife and I are pretty aligned politically, and I knew that before we got married. You know, look, I understand. I read these things that people don't want to. That used to be people wouldn't marry someone of a different race than themselves or different religion than themselves, and now there's all these studies that show actually people are more open to interracial and interreligious marriage than they are to inter-party marriage. And look, I understand that. I mean, I think that you know, the parties also have
James Carville would never be able to cut it today, would he?
Yeah. You know, this was a big thing in the 1992 campaign that he and Mary were talking secretly, and even back then that was a controversial thing. But what I'll say is, you know, the parties are now more ideologically aligned, so that it is hard to imagine being married to someone who has very different views than you have on reproductive freedom, or civil rights, or human rights. That doesn't mean you can't listen to people with different points of view and try to build human relationships around that. That's a little different than being married to someone. Married is a very, very close relationship. And you spend a lot of time with that person. And I have been happily married to someone who's a graduate of the Columbia Law School for 36 years.
There we go.
So that's my Columbia plug here.
There you go.
Can I say one more?
Yes, of course.
Briefly, I want to one more thing since we're talking to mostly students here. The same group came back about 6 months later, and we were sitting in Frank Luntz's house in Los Angeles, and we're talking that night about community policing in LA. And he would go around the room and say, first thing comes to your mind about LA police, and you'd say something, and someone said, racist. And he says, okay, why did you say that? And the young man says, well, we all know that the Los Angeles Police Department was created for the specific purpose of returning escaped slaves to their masters. And they've never really sort of atoned for that original sin. And they're racist to their core. Look, just last week they shot a guy, an unarmed black man in Compton 28 times. You can't do that if there's not something racist about your very makeup and your very DNA. Now, to the young man's credit, he knew who was sitting next to him. The guy sitting next to him was the African-American chief of police. Okay, who was from Compton, grew up through the same area where they just shot that young man. And Frank turns to him and says, Chief, how do you respond to that? Well, she says, well, look, Frank, all I can tell you is we weren't created till 1868. It's not possible for us to have been created for that specific purpose because slavery was outlawed by that time. And that's just false. And I saw the thing on the internet saying we shot this unarmed black man 28 times. Truth of the matter, we did shoot him 21 times. But he fired his weapon at my people 18 times. It's not factually accurate. And Frank went back to the young man, and the young man says, now, having heard that, what do you say now? And he says, I don't care, I know you're racist. Okay? That hurts. If you cannot get new information, and it's going to get harder and harder to get good information, and I get that, but if you can't change your opinion about something when you get new information one way or the other, then we're in a lot of trouble. I defended the president, even though I quit on January 6th because the president didn't live up to my standards as my boss. I defended him. I stopped doing that during the January 6th committee hearings because, like, wait a second, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. There's still a bunch of stuff I don't know. So I've gone from defending him to sort of saying, okay? If you can't get new information and change your mind, then again, we don't have a chance to deal with the issues we have to deal with. Sorry about that.
Seems to be a good plug for facts and how important they are.
And harder and harder it's going to listen. Pick a side in Gaza right now. If you see a picture of something that makes the Israelis look bad, and you are pro-Israeli, you can say, that's not true, that's AI generated. And if you're pro-Palestinian, you can say something that makes the Palestinians look bad, well, that's clearly deepfake, that's a Russian bot. It's going to be harder and harder to get good information, but you have to do it. I'm sorry, we got closing. I apologize.
It feels like a good time for me to remind everybody to tune into the PBS NewsHour and support your local PBS member station. All right, I'm so sorry. I waited too long to get to some of these wonderful questions, but let me see if we can address a few of these now. Aditya Shukla, thank you for your question, is asking, how much jurisdiction does the Chief of Staff have on advising the President on foreign policy specifically? How do they develop appropriate experience to do so? Ron, you want to take that first?
Well, I wasn't a big foreign policy expert, so I view my job as more as making sure he was hearing from the team, that there was enough time for foreign policy discussion with the president. Because when you're the chief of staff, you're trying to get the president focused on domestic policy, domestic matters. That's what's pressing up from Congress. That's what's pressing up from the states. And so building up the time for foreign policy work is kind of pressure in the system. And so I always try to make sure that the president had time every morning to meet with his national security team. And I'd sit in on those meetings, and sometimes I'd say something, most of the time I wouldn't. So if you have the right people around the president, you don't have to be a foreign policy advisor. He had plenty of them. As I said, Jake Sullivan, who's the national security advisor, is brilliant and does a great job of gathering that advice for the president. And Secretary Blinken, Secretary Austin, General Milley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs during the time I was chief of staff, was also a very straightforward and powerful advisor to the president. Mm-hmm. So I think, to me, it was more about getting the right people in front of him.
Same. I spent more time on budgets because it's what I engaged more on things that I knew more about. But when you're dealing with a topic that is not your specialty, you just make sure that the folks who have that specialty are there.
Jacob Drews, I'm going to put your question here, but I think we kind of answered it. Jacob is asking, how can we lower the temperature in our current political climate? Anything to add to the conversation we had earlier about how you reach across the aisle, how we close some of those gaps?
I mean, Washington's not broken. The country's broken. Okay? Matt Gaetz gets elected. AOC gets elected.
Washington's following the country?
Washington is not a leading indicator. It's a trailing indicator.
Could Washington set a better example?
I disagree with that. Okay. I think that the country's not broken. I think the country's more united than the political system reflects. I think you go out and, for example, if you went out and go in any part of the country, ask people, should we ban semi-automatic assault weapons? Large majorities in both parties say, yes, we should. There's no reason why AR-15 should be running around in this country. But Washington's unable to deliver that because of the partisanship in the Congress. So I think there's more things we agree on as Americans than the Congress agrees on. And I think the challenge is trying to make the Congress look more like the country and more responsive to the country.
You disagree with that, Mick?
People in Northwest Florida are completely happy with Matt Gaetz. That's it. People here are completely happy with AOC. It's just, there's a reason we have extreme fringes in both parties. Now, if the point is the tail is wagging the dog, I think that's a fair conversation to have, is that the extremes are driving the debate in both parties because that's where the energy is. I think that's a fair point. But you said it yourself. We're going to have a very, very close presidential election. Why? Because the nation is very evenly divided right now, and I think that's fair.
This is a good question to end on. Thank you to Brian Palacios. You both have about a minute to answer. What's one thing you respect about the opposite party?
Oh, there's a lot of things. Some of the smartest people I've ever met in my entire life are in Congress. Some of the dumbest are there, but some of the smartest people I've ever met. And I know this always comes out wrong when I say it, because some of my best friends are Democrats. They really are. I grew up when you didn't select people based upon their political line. I mean, I could sit down with dinner with Peter Welch all day long. Kristen Sinema. These are good people, and when you stop seeing people as members of the other party, or as members of your party, then maybe you can have a better friendship with them.
I have tremendous respect for the Republicans who've been willing to take political risk and reach across the aisle and work on matters with President Biden. I've learned something in every conversation I've ever had with Mitt Romney. And there are a lot of other Republicans who've been willing to offer advice, candid advice to the president and to his team. And I know how hard it is. There's a lot of pressure not to do that. And so I think the people who've stood up to that pressure and said, yes, we need an infrastructure bill. And I don't care if Donald Trump says he's against it. There's not building better roads and bridges and fixing LaGuardia Airport. There shouldn't be partisan things. Things all Americans should agree on. I'm willing to take some political risks to do that. I have a great deal of respect for the people who did that and continue to do that.
Ron Klain, Mick Mulvaney, thank you so much for being here. Let's do this again in
a
few months. Yeah?
Thanks so much.
Please join me in welcoming them. And now, over to Secretary Clinton.
Well, we will do this again. This was absolutely incredible. I can't thank you all enough. And I think it was, aside from the hits on the Senate, I think it was a totally, candid, open, and really informative conversation. So I'm so grateful that we have started this program at the IGP. We thank you both for coming. We hope maybe we can get you back again, because it's such a an incredibly refreshing, energizing, hopeful experience to hear the two of you talk from your various perspectives. So let's give another round of applause to Mick and Amna Nawaz. Thank you all.